Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said today that Canada supports Israel's right to defend itself according to international law, but he is expressing deep concern about the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
There are ongoing diplomatic conversations about consideration of humanitarian pauses, and that is something that Canada supports. Desperately needed humanitarian aid must reach vulnerable Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and Canada is working closely with partners to build a humanitarian corridor. Hamas must immediately release all hostages, and Canadians and foreign nationals who wish to leave Gaza must also be allowed to do so.
Hospitals in Gaza say they are on the brink of collapse. Food, water, fuel, and electricity supplies are in short supply for many Gazans. In Washington, U.S. President Joe Biden acknowledged the challenge Israel's military is facing, but he insisted the laws of war must be followed.
Hamas does not represent the vast majority of the Palestinian people on the Gaza Strip or anywhere else. Hamas is hiding behind Palestinian civilians, and is despicable and, not surprisingly, cowardly as well. That does not lessen the need to operate in line with the laws of war. For Israel has to do everything in its power. Israel has to do everything in its power, as difficult it is to protect innocent civilians.
Iddo Moed is Israel's ambassador to Canada. He joins me now. Ambassador, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me, David.
You've heard there the leaders of Canada and the United States. They're not calling for a ceasefire, but there is a push for humanitarian pauses in the fighting to allow aid into Gaza. Is Israel prepared to do this if Hamas also agrees?
So let me just at the outset mention the humanitarian situation of the 200 more hostages that are held who knows where, in what conditions, somewhere in the Gaza Strip, where no one up until now had access to, and nobody knows what's their fate. We only know that they're held by the criminals, the monsters of Hamas, who performed all these horrible atrocities, including rape and mutilation of people alive. So I think we are very, very worried about that. As far as Gaza Strip is concerned and the effort to alleviate the conditions for Palestinians, we must remember Israel is at war. Israel is fighting against Hamas terror organization that perpetrated the worst monstrous act against Israelis since the country was established. And so while doing that, of course, we take into consideration that we have to uphold international law, which we do very, very strongly and very transparently. And in that regard, of course, there have been convoys coming into the Gaza Strip up until now. There have been tens of trucks going in on a daily basis the last 4 days. And let me just discuss with you the numbers, because your reporter mentioned a few numbers of what is happening in the Gaza Strip. According to our information, which is based on constant contact with international organizations, they are at the Gaza Strip, close to the Rafah crossing, 350 liters of diesel fuel and 500 liters of gasoline, which are held by Hamas. Since the war started, Hamas has been telling the media that there is only enough for 24 hours, but that's an outright lie. No food shortage is recorded, and it's not expected in the near future. Food supplies in markets and private storage still exist. Activities at bakeries are directly affected by Hamas control. And so the same applies also for fuel for hospitals. They are rationing the fuel for hospitals, and doctors don't even know if they have enough for the next 24 hours because Hamas will not supply them with the fuel that they know Hamas holds.
Okay, but
so
Hamas, even if there are those liters of fuel in there, when the World Health Organization was able to get 34,000 liters, I believe it was, of fuel in the other day, that's enough for 3 hospitals for 24 hours and ambulances for that period of time. So we've had the World Health Organization on, the United Nations, the World Food Program, Doctors Without Borders, and they speak to a crisis inside there. And they are calling. It's not Hamas, it's these aid groups calling for this, fuel in particular. It sounds from your answer that you're not prepared to do this at all. Am I understanding that correctly? Because you believe Hamas has what it needs to help the civilians of Gaza? No?
No, there are 2 things here. One is what are the supplies in the Gaza Strip? The information that is published is wrong, needs to be verified by checking the facts. That's what I'm saying. That's one. According to our facts, and we have people who can check this for us on the ground, who are not Israelis, and they can verify that there are hundreds of thousands of liters of gasoline and diesel in the Gaza Strip. That's one thing. The other thing is the policy. Israel's policy is to act in accordance with international law, which means that we facilitate the provision of assistance and aid, humanitarian aid, to an area that is involved in this armed conflict, provided that this aid does not support our enemies, which are the terrorists, and we don't know that because we know that they confiscate much of the aid, and that it does not, and it is intended to support the people that it is intended for. So therefore, we are working as diligently and as hard as we can to verify that. But once we are at war, and we know that Hamas are trying to hide themselves amongst the population, it's a very complicated task.
No, and I can appreciate your security concerns and the challenges faced on verification inside the Gaza Strip. But is fuel a non-starter right now, sir? Because we've spoken to doctors and aid groups who say, you know, the incubators and the ventilators at hospitals are going to go off soon because we have no electricity. And I don't know if the international community can count on Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization in this country, to be reasonable. I think they're looking to Israel to be humane. So is fuel something you can allow in, conceivably?
We have supplied fuel for the southern part of Gaza directly in order for them to be able to pump water and to provide water for the broad population there. As you may know, Israel instructed or advised the population in the northern part to move south because most of the Hamas infrastructure is located in the northern part. We made sure that the southern part has enough fuel so that they can pump water for the population, because 90% of the population relies on water that is either desalinated from the sea or pumped from underground. Mm-hmm. While, by the way, Israel, you may know, still continues to provide water to the northern part directly from Israel, at least those pumps, those water systems that were not bombed by Hamas. So we continue to provide whatever we can to alleviate the conditions of the population, the vast population in the Gaza Strip. We try to keep them out of harm's way, and we try to alleviate their conditions because we know how hard this must be, but we also are waging a war, which we want to finish quickly and decisively to eliminate the infrastructure of Hamas, which is, by the way, not just a threat to us, but to the entire world, as Defense Minister Bill Blair just recently said. And I think we have to remember that the 200 hostages held by Hamas in unknown conditions are part of the humanitarian crisis, if there is any, at the Gaza Strip. That is actually the crisis. And the fact that this organization continues to perpetrate war crimes as we speak. Your reporter mentioned that she saw on the border smoke bombs and military activity from the Israeli side, but she must have also seen the rockets that flew today from the Gaza Strip into Ashkelon, into Netivot, into Netiv HaSara, and other places. This is a continuing war where Hamas is using the population as a human shield. Well, and we must finish that.
Just on the hostages, and obviously anybody with humanity wants to see their safe release. And your Prime Minister said tonight, or suggested tonight, there's the possibility of a breakthrough for the large-scale release of hostages being brokered through negotiations, with Qatar playing sort of the role as a trusted interlocutor in this. What can you tell us about where that is? I mean, do you have a sense on, and if there is a real chance that there could be a breakthrough on the release of hostages at this point?
Israel demands the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. That's the only thing I can say about that. Okay. All the rest are speculations and others, but this has to finish quick. This has to end immediately. You've seen the elderly that were released. That's a psychological war waged against Israel at the same time as this physical war is waged, and this cannot be tolerated. And the international community should unite against Hamas and against those who are behind Hamas to terminate this once and for all.
You heard President Biden's words that Israel should do everything it can to protect civilians as it prosecutes its war against Hamas and exercises its right to defend itself. I don't know if you've seen it, but there were difficult images on Al Jazeera today of a journalist for Al Jazeera whose family was killed in a missile strike, and they were in a refugee camp after vacating to start moving south, as the IDF has urged people inside Gaza to do. Did your military strike a refugee camp inside Gaza today? Do you know if that was an Israeli missile?
I know that Hamas does everything to put civilians in harm's way. So I would speculate that there would be another incredibly dire, sinister trick by Hamas. But I must tell you that in this war, where civilians are hurt, we must remember that 1,400 people were slaughtered by Hamas systematically and deliberately. I don't know if you've played this sound of one of the Hamas terrorists calling his parents from an Israeli mobile of somebody he killed, boasting that he has their blood of 10 Israelis on his hands that he just killed. And his parents tell him, that's wonderful, that's great, just keep well, continue. So in this war, in this horrible war that was forced on us, we are doing everything we can to keep those who are not involved out of harm's way. There are victims, but when we are considering where we strike and how we strike, we respect very, very much the rules of international law, international humanitarian law, the rules of the law of conflict, armed conflict, against a player who would have no regards whatsoever to international law. None whatsoever. So they will do everything they can to have more and more people, civilians that are not involved, get hurt by anything. And when we know that people were killed by Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets in a parking next to a hospital, I would have to doubt very much what was the cause of what you were describing just now.
Okay, and I have seen the video you speak of. I've seen a lot of very difficult videos in the last couple of weeks. Just as a final point, your Prime Minister said today that Israel is preparing for a ground invasion. There are reports in various international media that Israel is holding off to allow the U.S. to fortify its military bases in the region. Is this correct, sir? And what does this say about the risk of this spiraling into a larger regional conflict if the Americans feel the need to up their protection?
Well, we know from the outset that Iran is behind this hyenas attack, and that they are very much their desire is to broaden this conflict and to escalate it. The president of Iran mentioned just the other day that they might instruct, that's the way he used it, the word he used, instruct Hezbollah to enter this conflict militarily. And you know that there are already some clashes with Hezbollah in the north. There have been several provocations by Hezbollah in the north. And so when we look at the bigger picture, we see that Iran is the player behind it. So anyone who wants to have to restore stability and peace in the Middle East would be wise in taking actions that deter others from making this more complicated.
Iddo Moed, Israel's ambassador to Canada, thank you again for your time tonight, sir.